Welcome, everybody. It's really nice to see all of you. It's nice to be here for the first time in the Department of Architecture, School of Architecture, our Center for the Future Places, because we usually do our events in Salongen and we do our events in our open lab. But now we are being hosted by our new building here, and it's fun. My name is Tigran Haas, and I am the director of the, well, not really newly founded center. If you have been there for 14 months, you should start to let your roots come down. So Center for the Future Place is an international hub focusing on research on public space, and it's based in the School of Architecture and the Built Environment. And we do a number of events, talks, lectures, symposium, and also projects. So I don't like to do any promotion for the centers. I've never done it. So, but if you really want to contact us and find out what we're doing, it's best to reach us through social media. That means Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and our webpage. www.cfp.ab.kth.sc. So tonight is a little bit special because this is a new one, and all our series are based on Greek symbols. Well, partially I'm in love with Greece, that's number one. Secondly, everything started in Greece when it comes to democracy and public space and all those things. And there's a lot of nice symbols to use, and one of them is, of course, Athena. We have an Athena series. And this is a little bit different. This is the Ideal Polis exchange colloquium series, and I call it, in a sense, a limited edition. Some of you have been raised on MP3s or, I don't know, Spotify products. Some of us have been raised on LPs or cassettes or 8-track cartridges. I moved to CDs after being raised on LPs, and if you remember, CDs have different editions. There's editions that come from Japan, and they're usually highest quality made, and they usually contain a few bonus tracks. So if you even buy your favorite artist, Bob Dylan, you want to get a Japanese version because of the 2 extra tracks. So tonight is an limited edition, only published in 250 copies with a couple of bonus tracks. And that's my guest and my new friend, Srecko Horvat from Croatia. So we're starting a very special series of unusual, a bit controversial, open society lectures that are going to engage you and dazzle you and make you mad or happy. And this is one of them. So, and I'm really glad to host Srecko here because, what is it, 11 years ago? We come from the same part of the world, the Western Balkans, let's call it like that, speak the same language. But 10 years ago, I found out this book written in Croatian called The Signs of the Postmodern City by some guy called Srecko Horvat. And I read the book and I was bought by it. I loved it right away. And it reminded me of the book which was published by Venturi Scott Brown. You know, remember that, Learning from Las Vegas. And I know Helen is an expert on that book. Sort of a book on semiotics of the city, understanding the symbols of a postmodern city. And the case was Zagreb in Croatia. And I've been trying to persuade Srecko to translate it to English, but he said it's too old. It's not really worth coming back to. But anyway, but Srecko, from that time on, well, you were a philosopher, became a really prolific author and a political activist. And I think you were described by German Die Freitag as one of the most exciting voices of your generation, and I would agree on that. And Oliver Stone called you a charismatic Croatian philosopher. This is from Wikipedia, which is...
This is too much already, I mean...
I know, but you know, Wikipedia is really getting good. You don't have to, you know, second test it. It works well. And you've been writing for a lot of magazines. But the interesting thing is that you've been involved as an activist in the Occupy Wall Street movement. But the interesting part was in the struggle for the city, for the fight for the square of flowers, the Cvijetni Trg, which at the end kind of you guys lost, but you didn't lose the war. You lost the battle to a rich, corrupt real estate developer, right? So that was that very much Occupy Wall Street that spilled out around the world that you were involved in. And later on you formed also a think tank together with the former finance minister of Greece, and you've been involved, one of your close friends is Slavoj Žižek, a philosopher being loved and hated by many, an incredible guy. And you were founder of this Subversive Festival in 2008, which had Oliver Stone, Alexis Tsipras, Slavoj Žižek, Tarek Ali, Zygmunt Bauman, that unfortunately died recently, and David Harvey and Saskia Sassen was a good friend of ours. So it's a lot of that. And but my favorite of all of that is this beautiful program at Croatian TV, because I don't sleep very well. So I turn the Croatian TV on, usually late after the news. You skip the propaganda and you move to some other programs. And it was called The Fifth Day, wasn't it? Peti Dan, which had 4 of you You were maybe on the left, there's a colleague on the right, and there's some older people in the center. Beautiful discussions about all different current affairs, including the city, urbanism, political issues, economics, and so on. And that program, unfortunately, was a little bit closed down. Here you can see on the right side a lot of publications that Srecko did in English and in Croatian, and there was one that you did with Slavoj Žižek book. Your last book is about love, right?
Oh, no. The last one is about subversion.
Subversion, but the one before was about love.
Yes.
Okay. That's great. And maybe the next one might be back to the cities and urbanism, right? But your talk tonight is entitled Architecture Apocalypse, Apocalypse Now. So I think that's going to be very exciting. And the idea is that Srecko will talk for an hour and 15 minutes. And after that, we have a wonderful panel of 3 good colleagues of mine. Associate Professor Katarina Gabrielsson, from the Architectural and Urban Design Critical Studies. Soon to be Dr. Helen Runting, also an architect and urban designer. And last but not least, Dr. Pernilla Hagbert, who's working at the Department of Urban Planning and Environment, also an architect. And then we'll have an interesting discussion. So with no further ado, I'm so happy to open these Ideopolis limited edition controversial seminars with my good friend Srecko Horvat. Welcome.
So first of all, thanks for inviting me to Stockholm, and thanks for the nice introduction. I don't really think I deserve this kind of introduction, and I always feel a bit obscene when someone is talking about this stuff, you know, about yourself. And most of this stuff is already past, in a way, at least for me. I mean, the television show in Croatia and so on. But one thing is correct, precisely this book, which was called The Signs of the Postmodern City, was actually my first entrance to the theory of architecture, I would say. But it's not also, it wasn't only a theory of architecture, it was also a kind of practice of architecture. I talked a lot about protests, urban city struggles, right to the city struggles, and I tried to theorize it in the context of post-socialist Balkans, mainly Croatia, and what happened there. It's funny that if you look back at this book, which was published 10 years ago, most of the things are still in place, and actually they got even worse than they were at that time. Which brings me in a way to the central topic of today's lecture. So without any kind of digressions, you will see there will be a lot of them in the very lecture. Let's start immediately from the very end. And when I say the end, I mean literally the end of the world. Which means the apocalypse. So we will start with the end before we come to architecture in the second part of my lecture. So have patience. I know this is being filmed, so most of the points and things I will say now at the very beginning will probably be outdated. If they will survive at all, that's another question, and it already brings us into the topic. But nevertheless, I think that it's important to start precisely by the way which I will start now, even if this will be watched later or not. Why? Because I think that we are really living in extraordinary times today, and precisely by doing this kind of, how do you call this in computer language, compression, a kind of zip or rar of the recent events, we can get a sense of what I call the apocalyptic narrative. So what I will do is also a kind of apocalyptic narrative in a way, but on the other hand, it's a kind of warning and also a kind of invitation precisely for you, for the architects, to start thinking about global problems and to start changing them as well. So let's start from the first recent news. The news I will give you now at the beginning are, there will be no slides, so don't look there. I know that architects are used to slides, but I don't do it often. I'll ask you to use the imagination instead of the pictures. And you will see already the first news is about the last male northern rhino, which you probably know. I mean, not personally, but you heard about the news, and you can imagine what it means when the last male northern rhino recently died. this is the news which I chosen for the beginning because it directly brings it into the possible apocalypse. Because what happened in Kenya is that one of the last, so basically it's the last male rhino, died, although 2 female are still alive, but the problem is they didn't have sex, which is obvious. Why I'm starting by this? Because it is a clear sign that it is precisely the humans and our way of life and what we do, which is bringing to mass extinction. So the last male northern rhino is an animal which can be originated back to 7 million years. So this animal survived more than 7 million, if you can even imagine this number, years, but it didn't survive the humans. Some theorists would, of course, speak about the Anthropocene. I am much closer to the thesis that it has to do much more with something what we might call Capitalocene, that it has much more to do with a kind of special kind of sort of political economy we humans are used to in the past centuries than with the humans themselves, which is the thesis of the Anthropocene. Why did they die? Of course, they died not so much because of the humans, but because of political economy and because of the fact that that their horns and skins are a precious commodity, mainly in Asia. This brings us to the next news. So again, this is only the news from this week. Several days ago, scientists, biologists in France published a study saying that one third of the bird population in France disappeared. This is connected, you can see that all of this is connected with a much more deeper and complex system. So it's not only about the birds, they disappeared because the insects disappeared. According to some figures, flying insects all across Europe have declined by 80%. The reason for this is pesticides, and the reason for pesticides is, again, humans. So what we had in the last 30 years all across Europe is that the bird population declined more than 400 million. So this is, again, just another news from this week. Then we come to the most recent one, which is a report by the World Bank. Recently, the World Bank, just several days ago, published a report that by 2050, we can expect more than 140 million refugees due to the climate change and due to the natural disasters and climate crisis. So what the World Bank said is that we can expect more than 140 million refugees in 3 regions of the world, which is Sub-Saharan Africa, Southern Asia, and Latin America. And what they also said, so this is not, a leftist usually warning where the world is going in which direction. What they also said is that precisely because of this new migration crisis, which will, the current refugee crisis which we have, which is around 1 million people who entered the European Union in the last years, mainly from Syria, but also from countries such as Afghanistan and Iraq. This refugee crisis will look like a footnote to a much bigger refugee crisis, which is the refugee crisis which is coming because of climate change. So what the World Bank projected is that because of this huge migration, the biggest probably in human history, we will have new wars, we will have border conflicts, we will have new nationalism, we will have new walls. So what you can see already is that architects and architecture will also have to do something with this, because unfortunately someone has to build these walls. But also I think urban planners have to start thinking about the fact that what we will have is probably the biggest migration in human history. So I started with just 3 most recent examples from this week, but only during this week, we also have news connected to, so this is 1 week in human history, but history accelerated so much that you can see that besides this news about climate change, we also had the following news about current wars, rising nationalism, geopolitical instability, technology, and surveillance. Several days ago, only a few days ago, the Turkish forces, with the help of Russia, of course, have taken the Syrian town of Afrin from the Kurds. I think this is a major scandal for the West, and the silence of the West is an even bigger scandal. What you will have here brings us also to the news from the World Bank. Of course, you will not have climate refugees, but what you will have by destroying Afrin and destroying the Kurds in parts of Syria is new refugee flows, which will then in the end up in Europe again, which will then again provoke more nationalism, which will then bring countries such as Hungary, for instance, to build new walls or smart walls, as they call it. So you can see again that that this is a complex system which is interconnected. At the same time, when Afrin was liberated, as they would call it, from the Kurds, the CIA got a new director, who is called Gina Haspel. Maybe the name says something to you. Maybe some of you have seen the photos of her. She's notorious for being one of the CIA members who tortured people in a camp in Thailand, making photos about it. So here you can already see that the global situation is also rapidly getting more and more extreme. Just today, someone was appointed as the national security official in the United States, John Bolton, who was famous for advocating wars in Iraq and even interventions in North Korea. So this was just today. Well, there is more news before we come to the more theoretical parts, because what I want to offer is first to show in what situation are we finding ourselves today, and then to try to give a potential approach to this situation and an analysis of this situation. During this 1 week, basically 1 or 2 weeks, I happened to be in one part of the Balkans, which is specifically unstable for the, let's say, more than 1 decade, for several decades. First, I was in Tirana, then I was in Pristina, then I was in Skopje. At the time when I was in Pristina, why I'm mentioning these examples? Because these examples show, of course, I could have picked up any part of the world except the Balkans, because the Balkans doesn't have monopoly on nationalism. It's also happening in France, in Germany, in Sweden, everywhere. I happen to be there, so I'm choosing this example as another example of what is happening in the world today. So just as I left Pristina, there was and you know, Kosovo is still a very complicated part of the world. On the one hand, because of the presence of the US with the biggest military base. On the other hand, because there is still a dispute going on between, a territory dispute between Serbia and Kosovo, between Kosovo and Montenegro. So when I was there just that day in the parliament, there was a tear gas attack in the parliament because of the demarcation of the territory between Kosovo and Montenegro. What this shows is that actually in the 21st century we are again back to the question of national sovereignty, which most of us thought that this is a past. This is something which belongs to the past. At the same time, I was traveling from Pristina to Skopje, and at the same day in Skopje, due to fake news that the statue of Alexander the Great would be removed, there was a huge mobilization and protest at the main square in Skopje, where you can still find the statue of Alexander the Great. Again, this example, beside, I would invite all of you, if you are architects, I think Skopje is the best city, the best illustration what a postmodern city means, and what it means to rewrite history, and what it means for the perception of the people who are living there, and what it means actually to be an architect in a country which is rebuilding itself from a scratch, but actually from a much further away past, you know, something which belonged to thousands of years ago. Or at least they claim it, and the Greeks say it's not this case, and so on. So again, what you can see in Skopje, I was driving with a taxi driver to the airport, who told me that he's not driving the Greeks to the airport. then I arrived to the airport, and the airport, which didn't exist several years ago when I was last time in Skopje, now it's a huge airport, but it doesn't have the name of Alexander the Great anymore. So again, what you can see here is, on the one side, yes, we could talk about architecture, we will come there, but on the other side, what I want to illustrate by these two examples from Pristina and Skopje is that obviously the retreat to nationalism and the retreat to the nation state and rewriting history is back. You can see it everywhere, not only in the Balkans. You can see that Alternative für Deutschland, for instance, not a neo-Nazi, there is nothing new in them. A Nazi party in Germany is now, according to the latest polls, above SPD, which is the Social Democrats, and the Social Democrats are lower than ever in history of the Social Democrats. So you can see it in the center of the European Union. This is not something specific for the Balkans. So with the first examples, what I wanted to show is that we are facing much bigger problems than this, which is the problems of climate change and the so-called Anthropocene. With these two examples from the Balkans, I wanted to show that nationalism is back, which you probably know, but this happened just this week. And to move further, what also happened this week brings us to technology. What also happened this week is the so-called Cambridge Analytica Facebook revelations, which also has to do something with architecture, as we will see later. So probably for those who didn't follow this, this story, this was a huge revelation. But what it actually shows, since I was at that time in Albania reading probably one of the best Albanian authors Ismail Kadare, his Palace of Dreams, is much more important than the pure scandal of Cambridge Analytica. I will try to give you a parallel with that book. So when the scandal broke out, when it was revealed that more than 50 million profiles of American citizens, U.S. citizens, were harvested by a company named Cambridge Analytica, all the focus, the global focus, turned on Cambridge Analytica instead of Facebook. What I think is the case is that Facebook is much more important than Cambridge Analytica, and you can see it now slowly we are getting to Facebook. The real problem is also not only Facebook, but the essence of Silicon Valley and the business model, which actually is consisting in harvesting information and in privatizing something what we might call the general intellect. It would also soon bring us to architecture in the sense of so-called smart cities, where it is precisely cities today which are going into the direction of cooperation with big Silicon Valley companies, be it Google, who is then providing the data for the cities or so on, or Uber or Airbnb, and we can talk about it. But what I find interesting, and here I think that it's a small digression before coming to Uber. What I think is interesting here is precisely to read this scandal from the perspective of Kadare's Palace of Dreams. I don't know how many of you have read this book, so I will try not to spoil it. It's a book about so this book was written during Enver Hoxha's communist Albania, which probably is the most under-researched totalitarian system in Europe, which was a kind of North Korea inside of Europe. So the book was written during those times. Ismail Kadare succeeded to put it through the censor somehow, only when they realized later that the book is actually about current Albania and not about an Ottoman Empire, which is the book, this is the kind of background of the book. The book was already sold out, so the censors had a big problem. This is the kind of absurdist twist in this story. So what is the book about? How is it connected to Facebook and Cambridge Analytica? The book is about an imaginary Ottoman kingdom, the Kingdom of Albania in this case, where you have something which is called the Palace of Dreams. And the Palace of Dreams is a palace which is very similar to Kafka's castle, if you want, the castle in Kafka's book of the same name, which you cannot approach, which is mysterious, which you don't know anything about it, but it's very powerful. So in this book, Palace of Dreams, the main protagonist succeeds to enter it, and he actually gets employed by the Palace of Dreams. And what do? They collect the dreams of the whole population of this imaginary empire. They select the dreams, and then they interpret the dreams in order to get something which is called the archidream, in order to determine the future of the empire. So it's a kind of totalitarian Freudian analysis of the dreams, if you want, in order to look at the most hidden unconscious desires of the population. And isn't this what actually is happening with Cambridge Analytica and with Facebook? With Facebook, you precisely have this kind of palace of dreams, in the sense that what we are doing there, and it's not only Facebook, it is Google, it is Instagram, it is everything what you are using in your digital life. We are basically giving for free not only the conscious desires we have, but also the very unconscious, which we don't even know that we are giving away for free most of the time. And then you have something like Cambridge Analytica, which is not Cambridge Analytica, but behind Cambridge Analytica, you have Steve Bannon, who recently had a tour in Europe, which is then again connected to the nationalism, and held a speech in front of Front National and Marine Le Pen, saying explicitly that they should be proud and wear it as a badge of honor to be called fascists. So you have this kind of people behind, and hedge fund billionaires connected to Trump, which basically helped to bring, using technology, to bring Trump to power and to produce Brexit. So this is the apocalyptic, dystopian, realistic reality we are finding ourselves today. And the lesson of Palace of Dreams is that what is happening behind the closed doors of this Palace of Dreams or the castle is actually a brutal power struggle. And here I want to come to one of my last examples, because before going to the second, more philosophical and analytical part, which also happened only this week. So you can see history really accelerated, and it is again an example which belongs to the realm of technology, which you probably heard about, which is very connected also to urban planning today, if you want, which is the example of the self-driving Uber car killing a pedestrian in Arizona. So you can see that technology is going in all ways. In the first example, we succeeded to create one of the most sophisticated surveillance systems, which is not only surveilling us, but is actually pre-programming, as a sort of minority report, pre-programming elections and influencing what we want to desire, whom we want to have in power. And the second example is what happens when technology is automated but not sophisticated enough. Of course, this is not only Uber, similar examples happen to Tesla cars, at least two, as far as I can recall. So, if the last example shows what kind of future is lurking behind the newest technological developments, from automation to surveillance and pre-programming elections, the previous examples, again, I'm stating this happened only in 1 week, are showing in what direction the world is going when it comes to potential new wars or existing wars, ethnic cleansing, if you want, nationalism, refugee crisis, and so on. And here we come to Sweden itself. Wasn't it recently that Sweden introduced conscription again, only several months ago, and that it was prompted by, I'm quoting, by a security change in the neighborhood, namely the annexation of Crimea and the conflict in Ukraine. And what happened then after the conscription is something very interesting, I think, which shows that this kind of apocalyptic narrative is also present in one of the most developed parts of the world. You know, this part of the world where all these refugees from Syria and so on are aiming to come in order to find this kind of palace of their own dreams. What happened after the conscription was the reintroducing of a pamphlet from the Second World War, which then at that time was called What If War Happens? And if I heard right from one of my friends who is a curator here in Stockholm, the new title of the pamphlet, which will be distributed to more than 4 million households in all Sweden, will be When War Happens. I don't know if this is correct. This is what my friend told me. I found some information of the internet. But if this is correct, this is very interesting that you are switching from the pure potentiality, if war happens, to something which is considered to be a fact already when war happens. Even if this is not the case, even if this is not the new title, I find it remarkable that the Swedish government is going to distribute almost 5 million pamphlets about the coming war. The government decided, another quote, that there is a growing need for the people, I'm quoting, to prepare for crisis and threat of war. The pamphlet doesn't just focus, this is a quote again, on the threats posed by war, but also terror attacks and natural disasters. So here we have it. If you put all the examples which I mentioned from the beginning, the last rhino, the decline of the bird population, the rising nationalism in all parts of the world, surveillance, and so on. By the way, a terrorist attack just happened today in France. So if you put together all these examples, which happened only in 1 week, they were summed up by Sweden, by the Swedish government perfectly, which is now preparing the population that a war might happen. I could go on with other examples, but I want to come to the second part of the lecture. What I wanted to do with these examples, showing them as a kind of Twitter profile or Facebook where you can find all these news and then in the end you are so bombarded that you cannot even sleep, is to try to examine what are the possible approaches to this kind of situation. First of all, it must be said that we are obviously witnessing something which I'm tempted to call a sort of apocalyptic narrative. So of course, yes, the situation is dire and dystopian, and maybe it is worse than ever. Who knows? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But on the other hand, what we can see is a specific discourse of this kind of feeling which is in the air, even in Sweden, that a sort of apocalypse might be coming. And what I find interesting here, I've been doing a research on it and writing about it in a new book, which is going to be published by Penguin under the title Poetry from the Future, where there is a chapter precisely on the apocalyptic narrative. What I find interesting is the two main responses to this sort of narrative and situation. I would say that there are two main responses. The first one is something what, under the influence of psychoanalysis, I would call fetishist denial. And the second one is a term I invented, influenced by the first term, which I would call apocalyptic fetishism. So you can see they look completely opposed. What is the first one about? The first one about is it's basically a notion by a French psychoanalyst, Octave Manoni, who coined the term fetishist denial, saying that if fetishism, the Freud's term was Verleugnung, is defined as the projection of desires and fantasies onto another object or body part, for instance, the famous example of fetish for shoes, in order to avoid the subject's confrontation with the so-called castration complex, then fetishist denial is a sort of denial in which the subject is able at one and the same time to believe in his fantasy and to recognize that this fantasy is nothing but the fantasy itself. So if Marx's definition of ideology was they don't know what they are doing, but they are still doing it, the definition of fetishist denial could be described as they know what they are doing, but they are still doing it. And the problem from the viewpoint of psychoanalysis is, of course, that this recognition of the fantasy in no way reduces the power the fantasy has over the individual. What we can see today, just take the death of the northern white male rhino, birds, the decline of bird population, Afrin, and so on, is precisely this kind of response, is precisely this kind of fetishist denial, which could be put like this. We know very well that we might be living in the end of times, that a natural disaster could wipe out whole countries, or that a nuclear war might wipe out the whole planet. But, and here comes a variety of denials, under quotes, the world was always at the verge of destruction, yet it continued to survive, so we don't need to worry. This is the first thing someone will respond to all the examples I used at the beginning. Probably they will say, but if you take any week in human history, of course we didn't have the internet and so on, probably it was like that. So nothing to worry about. Then the second, of course, fetishist denial could be, but climate, we know very well that the bird population is declining. We know very well that we have less than 80% of flying insects in Europe, but still climate change is not true. Or you have another fetishist denial, which I think is the most common one. We know very well that someone from the United States could put a tweet and provoke a nuclear war, but there is nothing I can change about it. We know very well that climate change is really happening and that we might have 140 million refugees by 2050, but there is nothing really I can change about it. So what you can see here is that fetishist denial is basically a sort of acceptance of the status quo. And here I come to the second response to the prevailing feeling that an apocalypse is really coming, which I think we should put into the term of apocalyptic fetishism. If in the first case, you have fetishist denialism, we know very well that the world is ending, but we can do anything, so we don't do anything. On the other hand, we have fetishist apocalypticism, which might be summed up as the following. We know very well that the world is ending, so we are preparing for it. And you could have seen it, so this is another sort of acceptance, but it is not only acceptance, it is much more than it. It is a preparation for the wars to come. Just to illustrate this point, you could have seen it just at the time when Donald Trump became the newest president of the United States, when the New Yorker published, I would say, a remarkable article about the super rich preparing for the apocalypse, which already brings us to architecture in a way, because they wouldn't be preparing without having the help of the architects, because what you have now in the United States, and it's mainly people from Silicon Valley, which is very interesting, but also other billionaires and hedge funds and so on, they are preparing in the way that they are buying huge land masses which are above the sea level and so on. Many of them are building bunkers, so again you need architects to do it. Instead of changing the status quo, instead of doing something in this reality, at planet Earth, what they are doing is to prepare for the day after. You have a very similar situation with Elon Musk and his plans to go to Mars. So what you have there is, I think it's a false dilemma, whether should we go to Mars or not. Of course, we should do both. But what is being lost in this kind of white male Silicon Valley exploration of the space is precisely what is being lost is precisely the fact that we should change the very situation in our current reality instead of trying to escape our current reality. So at first glance, we might naively tend to conclude that fetishist denialism and fetishist apocalypticism are oppositions. While the one describes the passivization which comes out of the belief that nothing can be changed anyhow, this is what you will very often hear from your parents and from your friends and so on, but there is nothing I can do about Donald Trump, about climate change and so on. The second, apocalyptic fetishism, or the fetishism towards the apocalypse, describes the readiness to act and to be prepared for that which can't be changed anyhow. But it would be a failure to succumb to this false opposition. What is missing, I claim, as a real alternative to both fetishist denialism and fetishist apocalypticism, is a third option, which would succeed to go beyond this false dilemma. So if the proper answer is neither to deny nor to prepare for the apocalypse, what is the answer then? In order to get outside of the current deadlock, something what an Italian philosopher Franco Berardi before would call the slow cancellation of future. In order to get out of this slow cancellation of future, we need something what the French philosopher Jean-Pierre Dupuy calls enlightened doomsaying. This is the reason why I was using all these examples from the very beginning, not to scare you, not to do some kind of apocalyptic narrative, but precisely to do what Dupuy calls enlightened doomsaying, where he argues that what might seem impossible, a global scale ecological catastrophe or a nuclear war that would literally end the world, is nonetheless absolutely certain based on our present knowledge. So as you can see, not really an optimistic kind of assumption, but what he says then later is, assuming that this catastrophe is our destiny, we might then retroactively change the conditions of the very possibility of this very destiny. And to try to explain it, what this actually means and how can it be, this kind of theoretical concept that we have to take the apocalypse as our destiny and retroactively change it, to show in what way we can do it in our practice, or you can do it in our practice as architects, I still have to give a theoretical explanation of it, which comes from a forgotten, unfortunately, text by another French philosopher called Maurice Blanchot, which was recently rediscovered by Alenka Zupancic, part of the famous Slovenian School of Psychoanalysis. So it's a text published in 1964 with a genius title. I think this is one of the best titles ever. It's called "The Apocalypse is Disappointing." And what is interesting is not only the title, I'll come to the title soon and what it actually means, but that the very text was written in the same year when Kubrick did Dr. Strangelove. So Blanchot, 1964, so Blanchot's text is basically about something which at that time was called, with a capital letter, the bomb. You have the bomb also in Dr. Strangelove. So this is the times of the Cold War, where the bomb was all the time, like Donald Trump today and the other guy from North Korea, lurking behind our bag, behind us, and creating this sort of atmosphere, which I think we are back to again today, of the coming apocalypse, which is around the corner. So the main point of Blanchot's text, "The Apocalypse is Disappointing," is that the threat of the bomb, the master signifier, and its potential of total annihilation led to the birth of the idea of the whole of the world. As the whole, precisely, that can be lost or disappear forever. As Alenka Zupancic points out, the idea of the whole, of all that can be lost, this whole that can be lost, the whole world, but not only the whole world, but everything which is connected to the whole world, our unconscious, our desires, our dreams, and so on, I'm continuing with the quote now, only appears through a negation. It only constitutes a whole in the perspective of being potentially lost. So it's as you can see, Blanchot's thesis is very Hegelian. That the creation of the whole can only come through pure negation. Okay, you might ask, how does this give us any relief in the situation in which we are today? In what way is this option, the apocalypse is disappointing, an answer to the both prevailing responses to the apocalypse, which on the one hand is fetishist denial and on the other hand apocalyptic fetishism? Because, and I think this is really a far-reaching thesis, because without this sense of the whole, there is no way out. The apocalypse, this is the reason why it is disappointing. The apocalypse is disappointing in the sense that this whole is in fact empty of any concrete content and form. Although people are bound together only by their common disappearance, for instance, due to wars, terrorist attacks, refugee crisis, ecological crisis, or a total annihilation of humanity, we still didn't succeed to create this whole which we are going to lose. So this very whole, the totality of which some of us born after the bomb became aware for the first time at the beginning of the 21st century, is about to disappear. And we don't need North Korea to launch a nuclear attack. A simple tweet by Donald Trump is sufficient. But the problem is that it is still not yet the totality in the sense of a global human community, similar to the Kant's definition of this kind of community. So what Blanchot does is the following Hegelian twist. Instead of accepting, this is the fetishist denial in a way, or denying the apocalypse, it is precisely the inevitable apocalypse which lays the foundations for an inevitable change that can only prevent the apocalypse from happening, turning it into something that in the future is not inevitable anymore. I mean, if this sounds too philosophical, I think a good illustration of this point that you can retroactively change the present, and by changing the present that you can change the future. A nice illustration is the science fiction film Arrival. I don't know how many of you watched it, where you have the arrival of the aliens, and then the humans cannot communicate with them, and then of course you have the typical situation which probably would happen today, that you have, you know, the Chinese, the Americans, and so on, and everyone giving different meaning to the words about weapons and so on. And then the solution of the film comes from the future. In the end, the scientist succeeds to recognize the phone number of the Chinese general, and she calls him in the present, which comes from the future. So this is this kind of scenario. To come back, the apocalypse is disappointing because we will lose something. And this, I think, is a crucial point, because we will lose something, the whole, that we still didn't succeed to build. We will lose. What do I mean by the whole? What do I mean by this? This is a sort of a global community which would be able to prevent the refugee crisis, which would be able to prevent the climate crisis, which would be able to prevent the rising nationalism. It would be a truly global human community which would be based on precisely on the opposite principles on which the current global society, which is not even a global society, is based. So the point is that precisely by creating something what we are going to lose, we could actually prevent the end. To finally come to much more concrete architecture, since we are here talking about architecture as well, let me give an illustration of a case where I think the apocalypse wasn't disappointing. Just recently, I had the opportunity for the first time to visit Pompeii, and I think, you know, this is a dream not of every archaeologist, but also of every architect. And I will soon explain why I think it's important for the architects, and in how does it come into this context of the third response to the apocalypse. So what you had in Pompeii in 79, Anno Domini, wasn't the first case of such a massive destruction of an urban settlement. Recently, several years ago, in a city which is very near to Naples, which is called Nola, they found a settlement from the Bronze Age, which is, so if Pompeii is around 2,000 years ago, they found an urban settlement 4,000 years ago, where you can see that Pompeii actually happened before Pompeii. So there is not only one Pompeii. There are several Pompeis, if you want to put it symbolically. And this is important because what it shows is that the apocalypse always already happened, either historically, in this sense that the city just disappeared from the surface of the earth, like immediately, because it was a Plinian eruption of the volcano, which is very destructive, but also in the sense that the apocalypse always already happens somewhere. So I think that the best deconstruction of the apocalyptic narrative, which I think we can all very soon fall into this trap of saying the world is going into hell, you know, the world is going to end soon. What I think what we have to do is to deconstruct this apocalyptic narrative and say that it always already happened, but not only historical, but it is always already happening somewhere. So if it's not happening in Sweden, several days ago it happened in Afrin. If it's not happening to the humans, it is happening to the birds, and so on. Why is Pompeii so interesting? Because Pompeii shows that, first of all, that you couldn't escape the apocalypse. I think there is nothing the humans could do, and if the Mount Vesuvius erupts today, I think more than 300 million people in that area of Naples would be endangered. So what can the humans really do about it? It's really a question. But why isn't it disappointing that more than 10,000 people died 2,000 years ago? It's not disappointing precisely if you look at the architecture. Because what you can find in Pompeii, and that's really beautiful, is that 2,000 years, the Romans basically invented a sort of smart city, if you want. They were, in a way, much more sophisticated than the people or architects in the Middle Ages, for instance, if you want to put it like that. And they already invented many urban designs, if you want, which we are proud to have today. The first one is, which you noticed immediately in Pompeii, is when you walk on the streets. So when you walk on the streets, you will see this. You can see it on the famous photos. There is nothing there. So it's also an attempt to get you to Google it later if you want, or to visit Pompeii. What you will see on the streets is that you have this kind of streets, and then in the middle of the streets you have big stones. And if you're not informed, you come there and you don't know what these stones were supposed to be, but the stones are basically used as a kind of zebras for pedestrians. Because if you had a carriage going between the stones, it was going between, and it was forcing the carriage to slow down. It would slow down and the people could pass the zebra 2,000 years ago. So this is a very interesting urban design which existed in Pompeii, and which basically, this is the kind of twist, you know. We know about it today only because an apocalypse happened. We know about it today only because the eruption of Mount Vesuvius put so much dust and different layers of materials above this, like 10 or 20 meters, that it was only discovered in the 18th century. And it is beautifully preserved. The second thing, which is amazing, I think, is the thermal baths, the terme. In Pompeii, which had a very sophisticated system of heating the rooms 2,000 years ago. So where they were heating it by running heated water through cavities in the wall. You can still see it there because it's perfectly preserved. Then the second thing, which I found interesting as well, is a kind of McDonald's avant la lettre, if you want, a McDonald's which existed even before McDonald's. If you walk at something which is called the street, which is also ideological, very interesting, the Street of Abundance. It's called the Street of Abundance. You can find a lot of bars, you can find a lot of tavernas, restaurants, and so on, which are really beautifully preserved. There is even one piece, not there, but you can find it in a museum, one piece of bread, which was cut like this, and which was preserved even with a stamp of the bakery, which was preserved in this kind of, it was frozen in time, if you want. And what you can see there, why did they say it's a kind of McDonald's before McDonald's? What you can see in the tavernas is that they have this kind of round holes inside of the stone, which were used to put food inside. And they also had a sophisticated system of heating the stones so that the food would stay warm. And people would come and pick it up. You know, this was a kind of pickup of food. You don't have to sit down, you can pick it up. So that's another thing why I think the apocalypse in the case of Pompeii wasn't disappointing, because they were so sophisticated and they had a kind of hall. Of course, with a footnote, with slaves and everything and so on. But still, when it comes to urban design, I think it was really sophisticated, and actually even today we could learn something from them. The last but not least, there are many things, is also what only thanks to the volcano and to the apocalypse for them, it was an apocalypse for these 10,000 more people, the last thing, which I think is also a kind of, is very interesting, not so much to do with architecture, also in a way does, is the political graffiti, which you can still find in Pompeii, or you can find it in the Archaeological Museum in Naples, which are much better preserved. So what they did is that just before the volcano erupted, 79, there was a sort of elections coming or something like that, and mainly on the Street of Abundance, but also in other streets of Pompeii, they have written the graffitis on the walls. With color, you know, red color or something like that, which then comes from different sorts of flowers and so on. But in the other cases of Roman excavations or Greek and so on, you couldn't find it because color cannot survive more than 2,000 years. In this case, it survives precisely because of the apocalypse. What it shows is interesting, so maybe, yeah, it is connected to architecture in a way. It shows that already the old Romans and Greek had something what we called not only graffiti, but they had a kind of wall newspapers. And what is also connected here, you also come back to the brutal struggle for power. They were usually placed in front of the stores, of these tavernas or bars or whatever, where the owner of the store would put the graffiti in order to show his political inclination. So, in the case of Pompeii, it is precisely on the one hand, it is let's call it the apocalypse, the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, which preserved the urban design with all its small and big innovations and sophistications. But on the other hand, and here we come back to Blanchot, it also showed something else. That at the point of this apocalypse for this amount of people and those who lived in Pompeii at that time, they already succeeded to create this whole which was lost. Of course, you can claim that the Roman society wasn't the most equal society and so on, because of slaves and all other things, colonization and so on. There are many others who would say that it's precisely the Roman Empire from which we can learn a lot. And of course, you could also go in the direction of saying that they didn't succeed the whole in the sense of a global community. But in this small example, what you can see there, even if you come to Pompeii today, is a sophisticated, functional community which was a kind of whole for itself. And then it disappeared. But it is not disappointing, and this is the point, because they succeeded to build all these things, which we can see today. So to come back to the very beginning and to end soon, before opening the panel debate, all these fields which we covered from the beginning, climate change, refugee crisis, wars, natural disasters, technology, if you want, and surveillance, lead us to the role of architecture and urban planning. The point is that, as you can see in Pompeii, that architecture is always political. The terme were not used by the slaves. The terme were used by the, let's call it the bourgeois of Pompeii, you know, by the upper classes of Pompeii. Political graffiti also have a lot to do with the urban setting in a way. So my thesis, that's the reason why it's called Architecture or Apocalypse, the lecture today, is that the future of architecture, but also the future as such, our future, depends, among other things, precisely on the politicization of architecture. And that we really have to get rid of the idea that that architecture or urban planning is something apolitical. You know, there is a certain tradition close to Venturi and so on, which is saying that you can have either architecture or revolution. Because what architecture, according to this tradition, is a sort of building consensus. And the architects know that very well. You know, you have to constantly negotiate and renegotiate between the investor, between the ones who will live in the building, between the population and so on. So what you have to reach, according to this tradition, is consensus. What I would claim is that what we have to reach is to revolutionize our very own reality. Just take technology today, for instance. I think it's impossible to speak about architecture today without speaking about the recent technological developments. So just take the concepts such as smart city, smart home, big data, surveillance, 3D printing, augmented reality, which became popular because of Pokemon Go, the Internet of Things, and so on. All this is profoundly changing our cities, and it is changing architecture itself in the way architecture is being developed, and in the way architecture then, vice versa, is changing our own lives. What I found recently reading Arc Daily is that, and I think this is interesting because it will bring me to my final point, is that the 5 emerging careers in architecture today, according to that magazine, are the following ones. Chief Technology Officer, I mean, you know that probably better than me. Immersive reality modelers, virtual simulation designers, haptic interface designers, and data scientists. And it's, I think, you know, this kind of list of the new professions of the architects shows in what kind of situation we are finding ourselves today. And my point would be what might be the way out of this kind of specialization of architects, of becoming basically specialized technologists. What is missing in this list of the 5 occupations? Well, what is missing is the architect as a universal, architect and architecture as something which is universal. Not someone who would just deal with big data or augmented reality, but someone who would deal with the very future of our planet. And I think this is the role architecture should play today. Because what you can see today is that on the one hand, you have architecture which is serving the rich, which is serving also people such as Steve Bannon, which is serving the neo-fascists. What you can see in Germany, for instance, there is, you know, there is a kind of topology. What kind of architecture are the fascists or the Nazis or the neo-Nazis, whatever you call them, building? You know, they are usually building places which are very far away from the cities, small houses. Then they are building castles. Then they are building sort of army bases with the private armies. And something similar is happening in the United States as well. You can see it also with building the walls between Mexico and the US, with building the walls between Hungary, Serbia, and Croatia, and so on. So this is one way in which architecture can go. The other way architecture and urban planning can go is a much more emancipatory one, a much more revolutionary one, which is a sort of urban planning which I think necessarily has to stay and always be skeptical about the prevailing notions of contemporaneity, such as smart city, smart home, and so on, and not only pose the question, what is really the smart city? Is it really smart, but is it really giving something to the citizens who live in the city? But go beyond and start talking and examining the role of big tech companies, which are basically privatizing the urban landscape. So this is one direction in which architecture can take, for instance. I think the best example of these two sort of directions today is another one which will bring us back to the topic, and I will finish by this, is Puerto Rico. So with Puerto Rico, you had a perfect example how a natural disaster, in the case of Puerto Rico, it is the Hurricane Maria, completely destroyed the country, and which is an island. And what is happening now is very, very interesting. So very recently, Naomi Klein spent several weeks there investigating it, trying to show how Puerto Rico is the best example of what she already described by her concept of the shock doctrine in the sense that you have a shock, be it the war, be it a natural disaster, be it terrorism, and then it is used for imposing not only a certain ideology, but imposing very specific economic measures. So what is happening in Puerto Rico, what she showed just recently, is that again you have these two ways in which a society can go and in which urban planning can go as well. On the one hand, what you have now in Puerto Rico, and well, this happened to the Balkans as well, after the war and during the war, you have an influx, let's call it like that, of private investors, businessmen, multinational corporations who are trying to use the situation of the natural disaster. In the case of Balkans, it was the war, in order to privatize huge land masses, in order to build mainly hotels in the case of Puerto Rico, or when it comes to the libertarian ideologists, in order to have a kind of tax haven in Puerto Rico. And this kind of direction is not only something which is constrained to Puerto Rico. You have it, and again, urban planning is connected to it in the concept. I don't know if you heard about it of seastead. Seastead is a concept, not only a concept. Basically, they are trying to build it, which is, again, it's no wonder that the guy behind Seastead is Peter Thiel, who was, if you remember, the first biggest investor from Silicon Valley investing into Donald Trump's campaign. And he's a libertarian. So what Peter Thiel is doing, this is precisely the apocalyptic fetishism I was talking about. He's taking for granted and for certain that the apocalypse is going to happen, and that precisely what the World Bank is describing, the example from the start, is going to happen. So you will have huge rise of sea levels. You will have hundreds of millions of refugees fleeing from sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and so on, mainly to Europe or the US. Then you will have border conflicts, you will have civil wars, and so on. So the only solution, it is not Mars, as in the case of Elon Musk. The only solution is to build cities. This is the reason why it's called seastead, above the sea level already now. He was, I don't know in which phase the project is, trying to build it in French Polynesia. And the interesting thing here, politically and philosophically, is that what they are doing actually is, while the rest of the world is retreating back to the nation state, what they're doing is they're going beyond the nation state. So they don't give a fuck about the nation. What they're going to do is to build tax havens, which, if you have money, which is already existing today, you can enter and you can live there forever and happily and so on, as it goes in fairy tales. What is interesting is that they're trying to do this in a way in Puerto Rico now, that they're using the natural catastrophe which already happened there to try to develop this kind of society. On the other hand, what I think, and this is the choice I think the architects and the urban developers have to make, is to go into a different direction, which is the direction also which is happening now in Puerto Rico, a direction of decentralized economy, which then a lot has to do also with cryptocurrencies. To put it like this already happened after the Spanish crisis in Catalonia, where you had the creation of more than 600 cooperatives, which then created cryptocurrencies, which is called Faircoin, and which are trying to redevelop how economy and also basic human relations function. So if on the one hand you have the political economy of libertarianism, which is using the crisis to create a sort of libertarian utopia, be it in Puerto Rico, French Polynesia, or New Zealand, by the way. On the other hand, you also have another effect of the crisis, another response to the crisis. In the case of the Spanish crisis, this is the cooperatives, people who are going back to live in the villages, but are interconnected by technology, are growing their own food, and so on. And you can also see it in Barcelona. Of course, they have many difficulties, but I think Barcelona is one of the first cities in Europe which started a technology department, led by Francesca Bria, which is trying to offer different solutions to the main model governed by Silicon Valley. So what they are trying to imagine and to redefine in the very city is how Uber functions, how Airbnb functions, which is again connected not only to urban planning, but the essence of life of people or students who cannot live in the center of Barcelona because the apartments skyrocket and they are so high they cannot pay it, or by all the people who usually would use cars, but they don't, but they use a very commodified transport. So to finish, and to come back to the very beginning, yes, maybe the apocalypse is coming, as we have seen only from the news which happened this week, so in 1 week. But the good news is that, there is a solution, and the solution has to go beyond the two responses to the apocalypse. And at the end, I think it is precisely the architects and urban planners who have a very, very big, if not crucial role in ensuring that not only the humans, but also the animals and so on have a future on this planet. Thanks a lot.
Associate Professor, Dr. Katarina Gabrielsson, within urban design, you don't have divisions here, but it is within urban design and critical architectural theory, right? Soon to be Dr. Helen Runting, also within the same division or same field, urban design, critical architectural theory. Critical studies, yes, and originally from Australia. And finally, last but not least, Pernilla Hagbert, a doctor from Chalmers, our competitor, but now with us at KTH from the Department of Urban Planning and Environment, Critical Architecture and Urban Planning Studies. That's the three. Okay, I will give it back to you.
Okay, thank you, Tigran. I have sort of two initial kind of reflections, and I'll just say both. One is kind of juxtaposing the idea architectural revolution with architecture or the apocalypse. I think that's a really interesting historical study because, of course, architecture revolution is the famous motto or sort of claim by Le Corbusier in the early kind of modern movement in architecture, and advancing architecture into technology, notions of political progress, and so on and so forth, but also heavily tied into an idea of a kind of complete social order. Every person in, you know, sort of, it's really based on class distinctions and zoning of the city and so on and so forth. Basically that you have to control the masses, you know, the population, or they will rise into socialism or communism or whatever. And so if you reflect about architecture or the apocalypse, is really interesting because clearly the masses have to be rethought today, given what you know, the stuff you mentioned about Facebook and sourcing our political unconscious and so on and so forth. So the masses is one kind of very different category today as opposed to how it was considered back in 1924. And the other thing is the kind of significations of the continuous expansion of capitalism, technology, and so on and so forth. So I think that those two sort of terms are really interesting to sort of take our bearings, learning from history in order to understand things in a different way today. And the second reflection that I had was I was invited to do a lecture about a week ago to the court system, alltså mark och miljööverdomstolen, which I didn't even realize that it existed, but it's at a very high sort of court level where they take on, deal with conflicts in planning, we can say very simply. And the topic I was given to do a lecture on was urban design in the future, or design of the future, of the cities of the future, something like this, really completely bizarre, and I really didn't have a clue about how to respond to that. But it made me think about sort of drawing a parallel between how we can understand the future in relationship to how we deal with history. Because obviously historiography today is a lot to do with finding the kind of silenced sources, you know, the archives that haven't been made yet, identifying the sort of minor actors who've been superseded by the main narratives and so on and so forth. So I would guess that creating a different future, which would be a different future than the kind of the linear future based on capitalistic development, which is really the apocalypse as you describe it, would again be trying to detect the kind of hidden strands in the present that would point to a different direction. So somebody asked me, yeah, well, you know, please offer some good examples. And I was really, you know, I had to, I said, you know, you'd need to invite me back next year or something, because I really haven't been trying to find good examples. But I think it sort of did make sense. It was logical from that way of reasoning. You know, how can we identify these small kind of as yet hidden or unacknowledged or counter forces at work, and sort of promote them in order to allow for the creation of a different future than the one we're looking at right now, which I guess aligns with also what you were saying in terms of pointing to other processes.
Should I respond a bit?
Respond right away. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I find really interesting what you say, and I can only agree when it comes. So the 2 points you had. The first point, yes, unfortunately, I think in most of the cases, if you just look at Baron Haussmann's in France, where the role was precisely to prevent the revolution by, you know, making broader avenues so you cannot put a barricade. I think in most of the cases, unfortunately, architecture had a reactionary role, if you want. If you look at the pyramids and so on, it was precisely to preserve the status quo of the society. What I'm aiming at, I mean, it's a modest contribution as someone who is not an architect, is to try to imagine a kind of revolutionary architecture, if you want. And here I think your second point is really important, because what you said is that what we have today is this kind of linear conception of time, if you want. And this is really the capitalist conception of time. You know, I come from a part of the world where even today they claim after the fall of the Berlin Wall and communism, we are living in something what they still call, and it's never ending, it lasts for more than 20 years, transition. This is the concept of transition, and then they say, you know, what is the transition? You know, we idiots, we're living, you know, more than 40 years in communism, and well, we were, you know, starving and I don't know what in communism. The rest, which is the West, was developing and so on. Of course, they never mentioned that we had public healthcare, public education, highways, big infrastructure project and so on, but they just mentioned that we were lost. We were somehow lost in history. So after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we can now adopt and catch history, so we are in the transition period. This is not just the case for the Balkans, it's the case, I think, also for African countries and many other countries which are not part of the first world. What I think we have to do instead is precisely, I agree with what you said, a conception of history and time, which we can find, for instance, in Walter Benjamin, where he deconstructs the chronological concept of time, which I think is a capitalist notion of time and history, which means that you have successive events. Something happened and so on, and then also countries are being developed to a certain direction. I mean, the most famous example is the Angelus Novus, the painting Benjamin took from Paul Klee, which shows that what we perceive as progress is not actually progress, but it is an angel which is looking and cannot, you know, put down his, how do you call these, wings, because it is a catastrophe what we preserve as progress. What it concretely means, I think, you were asking whether there are some examples. I think it means to try to look in the present from the historical events from the past. That's one thing, I think, which still didn't fulfill their emancipatory character. So it means that, you know, although we are I'll give you Balkans again, you know, because I come from that part of the post-communist world. Today we are living in a phase of utter historical revisionism, which is, you know, when the war started, more than 2,000 monuments, anti-fascist monuments, only in Croatia were destroyed completely, and streets are being renamed and so on. You have this everywhere, you know, after the collapse of a certain system. So what I think we have to do is to say, okay, yes, communism went in that direction. We have to criticize the Gulag, we have to criticize the surveillance system of communism and so on, but there is an unfulfilled emancipatory potential in these events, which I think we don't have to return back to them, but we have to use them to create a different future. And I think it is very crucial to have this kind of different conception of time, because I think time is also an under-researched area of the development of capitalism, which is so crucial, especially in the times of social networks technology, where we have the, you know, feeling that we live in a constant present.
Can I just add?
Yep.
Gabriel Rockhill wrote this text or article, book chapter once, when he pointed to the kind of accusation towards Marxism of being a sort of system of determination and based on a kind of linear thinking that the revolution is inevitable. That whole system of determination has now been exactly what characterizes the narrative of global capitalism. There is only one way. There's only one way forward. There's only one progress. Either you're following a line or you're doomed, and so on. I thought that was an interesting observation. Yeah, that was just a comment.
I would add, but I spoke too much, so.
I feel like I prepared questions rather than a reflection,
Oh my
but I'll give it a go. Thank you so much for the presentation. I really was sort of sitting and thinking and scribbling, and I certainly have a sympathetic position to your own in terms of what critical theory can do. I think the task of critical theory today would be very much the production of an urgency, and I've thought about a lot in terms of good urgency and bad urgency, this sort of restlessness, the anxiety that Bifo Berardi would write about constantly, or Lazzarato. We see this in the whole semio-capitalist sort of argument. But there's another kind of urgency that pushes towards change, right? So this is a performance, I would say, in producing urgency in an audience, which to me was quite effective and affective. So thank you for that. I guess if I were to phrase a question then in my reflection. It's thinking about, I also agree with you that we need to think about architecture at the scale of the population as a biopolitical technology. I think we need to think about it. I feel that you're suggesting that we can think about it in terms of an infrastructure. And I'm aware that there are huge problems with many of these terms and associations with a century of horror behind us and continuing at the same time. But in thinking about architecture at this scale as this kind of universal, or as able to act in a universal sense, we're somehow haunted by the images of Super Studio, I think, the Italian radical kind of architectural moment in the late 60s, early 70s, where we're confronted by these images of a future of expansion, where this is diagrammed, this infrastructure takes over the world, it's rolled out, and it's sort of presented to us, I think, in order to disgust us and to repel us and to negate that at the same time that it's very, very attractive. So what I'm interested in is I sympathise, and I'm definitely taking the same position, that architecture needs to operate at these scales of populations of the globe. But at what point, how do we conceptualise that without falling into the trap of an infinite expansion, which would be the capitalist logic? You know, you roll it out one after the next, these kind of diagrams that just expand like land speculation over a territory. How do we think at that scale without thinking in that way? Really hard question.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I mean, thanks for your reflection as well, and adding Lazzarato and Bifo and semio-capitalism to this. Well, it's really a complicated question, because what we can see on the one hand, I think, is that if this is true, and I guess it is, what the World Bank is saying, that you will have 140 million refugees only from 3 parts of the world, they didn't cover the rest, and they didn't cover other natural disasters which might happen or other catastrophes. If this is correct, what we will need at the one hand, so I don't know, I don't have an answer to your question, but I'm trying to think about it. Then on the one hand, what you will need, what it will be necessary more than ever, is a sort of central planning. What was missing precisely during the refugee crisis in Europe, I would say, where even Zizek was misunderstood when he said that we need an army to solve the refugee crisis. He wasn't a kind, you know, Zizek didn't do a fascist twist, you know, but he said that, you know, instead of leaving these poor refugees and people being forced to, you know, go by boats through the Mediterranean, go through the Balkan route and so on, what Europe was supposed to do is a kind of central planning, taking the army, helicopters, boats and so on, and bring the refugees to Germany, for instance, or to Sweden if you want them. But this, of course, also doesn't solve the problem, because I think in the refugee crisis, this is not the problem. The problem is that the first step should be to prevent the wars, so you wouldn't have the refugees. But what I wanted to say is that you need this sort of central planning when we are faced with the catastrophes which are obviously coming. So if you have more than 100 million people who are refugees now, without central planning, we are definitely going in the direction of civil wars and an even bigger catastrophe. We don't have it. We had, as you said, that's why it's so complicated, the experience of central planning, which is not necessarily, if you're not a Stalinist, it is not provoking a nice, how do you say it, a nice... atmosphere. Yeah. I mean, yeah. When you hear central planning, basically what you see is the Gulag. You know, someone had to centrally plan it to send all these people. That's the end. But there is something in central planning. This is this kind of what we have non-linear thinking. There is something in central planning which I think is useful, and we have to redefine it again. So if you want another example, who is the most successful today in this sort of central planning? China. If you take One Belt, One Road initiative, this is the biggest infrastructure project of maybe of mankind, but certainly of 21st century, which is of course driven by economical reasons and so on. But you can see that China is so successful, even when you now speak about economy or geopolitics, more successful than Europe or any other nation state, precisely because of the reason, because it is not a nation state but a civilization state with you know, thousands of years of history. And on the other side, because they can really plan 20 years in front. So okay, we need to connect, you know, Beijing with London and with Hamburg and so on. We build a railway here. We will use the economical crisis of Greece, so we will buy the port of Piraeus. We will connect it to Idomeni and then connect it to Bulgaria, blah, blah, blah. And I think we need more projects like this. The problem, of course, is the origin and the source and what is happening in China now, which is their Cambridge Analytica, Facebook, the social credit rating system and so on, and surveillance system and less democracy and blah, blah, blah. But anyhow, I think we should, on the one hand, look in this direction of central planning as a possible solution. The problem, again, is in order to have central planning, you need to have a kind of community. You need to have a political system which is able to plan centrally, which is very difficult. And the second, just to finish, the second, on the one hand, if it's central planning, the second, I think that we need more and more decentralization, which is, again, you know, it's not a contradiction. So if you have kind of this dystopian scenario where the world is falling apart, and you will have more and more cases of Puerto Rico, Haiti, and so on, it will be impossible to have this sort of central planning, so they will be forced to rely on their own sources, be it solar panels, be it water sources, be it, you know, this kind of semi-autonomous community. So I think we need a combination of these two. How to achieve it? Well, architecture is not the answer, politics is the answer. I mean, it has to be a political solution for this.
I absolutely agree. I will hand over that microphone, but I just wanted to say it's really interesting thinking about that response in relation to the Swedish, and in fact, pretty prevalent European response to the migration crisis having been about affected, emotion-driven responses from individuals based on having private property like a home that you can then rent or give to these other individuals. And I think we see, I'd like to, if I get another question, but not yet, also raise...
We're not in a hurry, right?
But I'd like to raise the issue of being useful as well. Is it okay if I ask one more question? Because I was thinking about this while you were speaking as well.
As an architect.
Being useful as a human, maybe we could say. Because Laurie Penny in the UK context does a really interesting feminist critique of apocalypse as an aesthetic within sci-fi, where she makes the point that a lot of the kind of alt-right science fiction usually projects a world where men with brute strength can become useful again. And this often implies a kind of a world where one could, you know, protect the women in the compound, where it's a sort of a dream of like an emancipated future where you don't have to type at the keyboard. It's an escape from the drudgery of every day, and it's a kind of world where you don't necessarily need an education. What you need is brute strength in order to overcome your enemies in this super exciting new post-apocalyptic condition you find yourself in. And I just wondered, it's a sort of, I mean, she of course links it opposite to the alt-right in a sense of becoming useful, of populations that feel unuseful. You know, this kind of push towards fascism, which we could link to post-industrialism. But I wonder how you respond to that feminist critique of the use of the apocalypse, because it doesn't seem, it makes certain bodies useful, these imaginaries, and you're in an ambiguous position because you're arguing against but with. And I just wondered, where do you position yourself in relation to that kind of feminist critique of the use of the apocalypse to produce a very non-feminist future?
Okay.
I swear I won't speak again.
No, you will. I'm thankful for the question because I'm a big fan of science fiction. And as a big fan of science fiction, I would say there is an interesting development in science fiction where I think we could say that there are particular science fiction movies, if you speak about movies, which are kind of feminist, if you want. Like where it is precisely the female protagonist of the movie and this imagined future, which is being more powerful than the man in the end, and which is actually giving the keys for resolving the catastrophic situation. So first, which comes to my mind, and it is by intelligence, and it is not by using the body. First, which comes to my mind is Ex Machina. Where you have an artificial intelligence female, which outsmarts both the guy who was supposed to fall in love with her and the guy who was based on this kind of Facebook, Google, Silicon Valley white male guy for whom even female robots are just an experiment. So this is good, I think. And the second one, which I think brings us directly into feminism in a way as well, is I don't know if you watched that one, Girl with All the Gifts. That's really, that was one of the best in the recent time. It's about zombies. And it's interesting that usually in the zombie genre, all of them are stupid. I mean, what is the definition of the zombie? They just walk around and they are basically they're stupid, like stupid consumers just walking around. They don't have any kind of intelligence and they don't have any kind of will. So what you have here in this movie is that most of the population, not most, almost all, became zombies, but there is one girl who, that's the reason why she's called the girl with all the gifts, who is a zombie, is female, and doesn't become stupid. It's not this kind of walking death. And sorry for the spoiler, I mean, but it's really important. Shall I or not?
Yeah.
It's really, so you don't need, but you can, you watched it. Yeah. So at the end, and I think this is crucial, and this is a good point also about artificial intelligence. We shouldn't be scared of artificial intelligence. At the end, she walks around with this doctor all the time, and then they realize that, all of them are becoming zombies because a kind of natural catastrophe and the plants putting something in the atmosphere, blah, blah, blah. And now the doctor is closed, so she's not polluted by this kind of air, and the girl is outside, and the girl small girl starts to, gather other zombies who are not stupid yet and so on. And then she makes the most, I think this is the best ending of a movie, it's a spoiler, of course, where she says in the end, why would it be us who have to die so that you humans can survive, says a zombie. And I think the same point can be made about artificial intelligence as well. Because I think with this kind of apocalyptic narrative, I think that's part of the apocalyptic narrative, what is being constructed here is, again, I think it is very narcissistic as well, if you want, and male even, if you want. The world is going to end and we will all disappear and so on. I mean, of course, this is bad news from your own narcissistic individual perspective, but it is good news for the North-white male and female rhino. It is good news for nature, it is good news for the planet and so on. And when it comes to artificial intelligence, you have this kind of technophobia today where everyone is scared, what will happen with automation, Uber, cars killing us and so on. But why wouldn't we imagine a kind of artificial intelligence, female if you want, at the end who will say, why would it be us and not you? So isn't this fear of the artificial intelligence actually a very human fear that we will lose the absolute power which we have according to the Anthropocene theory? So why wouldn't artificial intelligence take over in the end? I don't know.
I have a question about her, but I'll let you.
Her, yeah. But again, Her is a good movie where the computer and female just gets rid of what Joaquin Phoenix.
Fetishism, though, that we imagine that this smart and incredibly kind of like affective being leaves us at the end because she's disgusted by humanity. It's also a kind of indulgent imagination. Oh, anyway, sorry.
No.
No, but it's Her is a great example. Yeah.
Well, I was gonna pose sort of a different or a complementing narrative from another sort of within the latest week that I experienced, but that ties into this as well. But also this understanding of what are we putting at the center of the story. So a week ago, there was an article published by a group of researchers at Gothenburg University, basically stating they're working in a project on looking at global population in relation to climate change and environmental degradation, which in itself is an interesting question and sort of has been a question for a long time. Wouldn't it be better if we were less people? But so they, from this potentially interesting research project, they decided to publish a debate article in a Swedish newspaper, stating that this is an argument for reducing migration or for discussing migration, and this coincided with the Swedish Democrats, our nationalistic party, having their election conference this weekend. So it wasn't a hazard; it was sort of intentional, framing the story of the future collapse of the Earth as being something both driven by humanity. But in the same sentence or in the same article proposing, well, the solution to that is enclosure. So their argument was saying we're focusing too much on an anthropocentric perspective. We need to stop caring so much about the humans and instead sort of using this deep ecology narrative of an ecocentric view. And this has also been a side effect of sort of the deep ecology movement, which is sort of this preserving by excluding idea, but so very strongly linking this also to the narrative of migration and sort of emphasizing that the only way of keeping Sweden sort of environmentally friendly or managing our resources is by locking people out, basically. And this spurred responses, partly by me and my colleagues and others who were arguing this. Also, the funders of this research project actually wrote sort of an article saying, well, hey, this is not what we're funding you to do, and that's quite rare to have funder go out and do that. But with this, just the last week, it was sort of this narrative of how we understand what is changing. Because in that article, the original article, they were also choosing to say, this was sort of the main narrative, and in a side note, they were saying, because an issue is that more people will lead to, we'll need to densify, we'll need to build more housing for these people, and that will be a damage to Sweden, to our environments. We will have less green space and so on. So by taking that narrative, they're saying sort of a deterministic that this is the way it is. This is the way we plan. This is the only way we can build our cities. This is sort of the trending narrative of urbanization and so on, urban economy. So that was that was the static point. The built environment was the static point. Instead, they were talking about these climate change as being this dynamic force, migration, but this one thing, the built environment, is something that's untouchable. So we tried to turn that argument on its head, which is what the thing we can change in this is how we respond to that. So by flipping it, it's not really saying we need to close our borders. We might need to want to change how we build, for example. So just connecting this to this narrative of what are we taking for the static and what's the dynamic? What is it that's changing? Why do we imagine it so hard to change, for example, how we build our cities and this narrative of urbanization, but we find it really easy to change, this argument then to say we need to close off Swedish borders, we need to build a military preferably to sort of save us from all these refugees and so on. I mean, these are large political geopolitical and these global community aspects, but we can't change this one thing. We can't change densification. That's a natural force. So it's an interesting, this narrative of what's deterministic and what's transformative.
Yeah, thanks for you'll give me the reference to the paper later. Well, the first...
It was in Swedish though, but you can Google Translate.
Yeah, of course, I do that. No, I mean, my first spontaneous reaction would be what Frederick Jameson famously said, and then it was repeated, and it's still repeated by everyone, that the basic problem is that we can imagine everything, even the end of the world, but we cannot imagine the end of capitalism. And this is the basic point, you know, and, you know, I am a kind of intruder here in Sweden. I don't live here, I don't know so much about your history, but if I learned anything from Sweden, and it brings us to this problem, I think, you know, this fear of refugees and what shall we do instead of really changing the very system. If I learned anything about Sweden, it is from Ruben Östlund's movies. Because I think in both these movies, which are like Force Majeure and Square most recently, you have this kind of ideal Swedish community. In the first case, you have a family, and in the second place, you have, you know, a posh art curator and so on. And what happens suddenly, which changes the whole society, is this kind of penetration of the Lacanian real, if you want. You know, something happens, which can be small or whatever. In the first case, it's provoked by the natural catastrophe, and the man doesn't provide shelter for his children, and the whole relationship changes suddenly because of a natural disaster. So, which is again interesting because it shows how to react to natural disaster and what we should do. And the second one in Square is also this sudden, very contingent event where the art curator is robbed from his wallet, and then, you know, he's forced to confront the immigrants and so on. And what I think, what both movies show is precisely what you say. You know, how this, you know, we have a static system, which is then became dynamic because of an avalanche in the first case, and you have a static system which became dynamic because of the immigrants again. And I think this is the best example where you can show in what sense a system is going to respond. I don't know, maybe I would go back to that the Swedish political system and society is for the last decades based on individualism. Of course, you have the welfare state, but at the same time you have you know, this kind of radical individualism where each person is really an individual, where not even your family has to help you because you have the state who will help you and so on. Maybe it's a wrong reading, but that's my impression, and I think out of this come all these problems with, you know, what do we do with the refugees now? That's my impression. I don't know. I haven't been to Sweden.
I was just thinking about what you mentioned about the plan for the Swedish government to put out a brochure, and the question whether it was going to be titled "When the War Comes." I don't know if that's true or if it's going to be called "If the War Comes," but I think it's good to know that not so long ago, part of the telephone directory always contained a couple of pages at the end called "If the War Comes," telling you where the nearest shelter was.
What a telephone register?
Yeah, this was before things became digital.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know when the last year was when the telephone directory, if it was. I'd say like 12 years ago or something like that. But it used to be, you know, every year the new telephone directory came out for the whole country, and they even had art on the cover, and they had all kinds of things, because it was like a milk carton. It was something that everybody had in everybody's home. So it was really a medium also to communicate at a large scale. And I don't remember when they took out those pages at the end, but I remember them. So you used to have instructions for what to do when the war comes, or if the war comes, including where the closest shelter would be. And nowadays they don't build concrete shelters in new housing like they used to do, I think up until the 90s, actually, 80s and 90s. So, but I think it's really interesting because in connection to individualism and resilience and civil society and so on, that whole narrative that is sort of trying to create a society fending for itself and not expecting the state anymore to step in for them. Part of that is sort of I think it is really tied up into some sort of neoliberal development. I mean, there was the tsunami catastrophe. How long ago was that? 10, 12, 15 years ago. And Swedish citizens who go all over the world for their vacation, and when this catastrophe struck them, they were sort of expecting the Swedish state to come in and fly them home to safety immediately. You know, so that was quite a bit of a sort of conflict and disturbance around that. And at the same time, the Swedish state was really ill-prepared for any kind of crisis. We pretty know that by now. I think maybe things have improved, I don't know. But I'm just saying all of this to point to this kind of very difficult tension between, on the one hand side, risk awareness, sort of knowing the basic facts about how to cope with the fact that we're living in an extremely fragile society. I mean, it would take like 3 days of a power cut and we'd be out there fighting in the streets because you wouldn't get hold of food or all of this, you know. So we need to have some more sort of knowledge and preparation in terms of how to cope just with a power cut, you know. That points in the direction of sort of designing the population at an individualistic but also a kind of civil society level. And you can imagine that that's going on while the state is stepping back. And then again, it's the state that takes these measures to ensure that people must be able to fend for themselves for at least a week, which is what's being said now. You know, everybody has to be able to survive for at least a week before they're going to get any help from anyone. So, and I think this connects to what you were talking about earlier about central planning, some sort of totalitarian central planning on the one hand side, and at the same time something which sits very uncomfortably with democracy. And at the same time, something that's much more decentralized and local and specific, and a much more sort of a multiplicity of ways of doing things in a non-linear way. And, you know, just sort of to frame those sort of conflicts or tensions, I think, is part of what we've been talking about, and is sort of captured in this brochure that's going to be issued, whether it's going to be if the war comes or when the war comes.
If I can spontaneously react, just to give you as a Balkan. Or just very, very quick. I have this mic, this stupid mic. I would prefer to have this, but as a Balkan person who arrived yesterday from the Balkans, you know, two things which struck my eyes or my feelings were, the first one is at the airport. I'm trying to catch a bus, and I hope, okay, Sweden is this country where you don't need cash, so I don't take any kind of cash, so you have the credit card. So I'm prepared, I will jump into the bus and, you know, put the credit card and come to the city center. Immigrant bus driver, no chance. You have to go back to the airport and buy it. But please, I will be, the next bus is coming in half an hour, I have to, you know, it's a long day and so on. No chance. He wouldn't leave me to get into the bus. But then another person arrives, also an immigrant, who decides to give me his ticket. So what this shows, this short example, is that, you know, on the one hand, you have this kind of automated system where even an immigrant bus driver who otherwise wouldn't do that. In our part of the world, you just negotiate. Please let me in, I will buy you a drink or whatever. In Sweden, it's obviously not like that because of it's connected to technology. And then I'm driving on after the bus, I took a train, and then I'm driving on the train, and there is a poster with a sick guy in bed with a kind of iPad or mobile phone in front of him. And you have 24/7, you can reach your doctor and so on. And, you know, for me, this is a sign of utter depression, you know. So there is no one else, not even the state, there is no family or whatever, you just reach out to the digital device if you're sick. And I think this is one serious problem of Swedish society, which people from outside, you know, Sweden for us is still this kind of heaven, you know, social democracy, standard is kind of still good, the economic crisis didn't hit you so far, you're a tolerating society, whatever. But on the other hand, precisely this technological development, I think, is scary. You know, that Sweden is the first when it comes to cashless society. You know, we speak about Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, but it's already happening in Sweden, where all what you do, I mean, from your bank account to gym and so on, is interconnected in one system. So again, you have this sort of central planning, and yeah, the question is, what would happen if a catastrophe happens? Huh?
Who are the experts in charge of that planning?
I don't know. You know.
No, I mean that's a good issue if you wish that there were more experts in charge. But who appoints them, and how do you define the expert nowadays? Don't think that's for sure.
No, I think we have to get rid of the idea of the experts as such. You know, how can an expert for, I don't know, for online dating or an expert for online doctors bring a solution to this kind of complex system? You really need someone who can take the broad picture and not just be an expert for something. Because if you're just an expert for something, then they use you to precisely do what the politicians decide to do. That's the problem. Who are the politicians, I think, that's the question, who are imposing this kind of system? And why are the people accepting it? That's another question.
I had one thing I wanted to just add in as an element in this discussion, given that we are here at the architecture school, and that's I guess that we've gone through these waves of, and it's hard to periodize this, but you could say that there's been a period within architecture where the agency of the individual architect has certainly been advanced, and we see a lot of responses to crisis, which are about going in, say, as a student in a diploma project and trying to fix stuff, or individually, I have friends within the more, let's say, participatory relational aesthetics moment that described what happened after the earthquake in New Zealand, in Wellington, and they all kind of flew in with their spatial practices and started to make temporary kind of art piece houses and talk to people, and they were they actually shocked themselves, I think, at that moment, and it was clear that it was a sort of global ambulance chasing elite. I'm sorry, that's a harsh thing to say, but what I'm wondering then is, for the students in the room and for those of us engaged within architectural practice, I think, and it's more a reflection than a question, but resisting the sense of agency that would push us into individual responses at the same time as feeling empowered is a really difficult kind of tension within the subject, especially the subject who imagines themselves as the architect. I'm not sure, it's not a question, it was more a reflection on how we manage those two poles, because it's a really tough one.
Yeah, I think it brings us back to your comment before when you said, that I think this is it's the same as the dilemma between central planning and decentralized. And this is, between the urgency, which is a real urgency, and the let's say, not to do it. Because what do I know how to construct society which is in ruins? This is the constant, maybe we need a kind of dialectics of these two. None is the right answer, because I think very often we fall into the trap of the urgency. When you don't, there is a real urgency, and like the refugee crisis, and you don't come up with a real solution. The solution is not either to bring them all to Germany or to close the borders. The solution is to stop arms, selling to Saudi Arabia and so on. But of course, for that, again, you need a political level of action. So, yeah.
But I think that's sort of the idea also of architects as being this rhetoric about shaping the future, and sort of this very very dual role that we also educate our students with. That sort of your part of building, and it's this pressure also put on, of course, this new generation that will do things better and smarter, and the saving of the planet is in your hands, right? So it's or in your kids' hands. So it's this constant sort of also push to say that there is need for constantly more action and sort of more urgency. But there's also this idea of how we understand architectural practice as being disruptive within a system that might be, there's an idea that architects can do good. There's less of a discussion about doing less bad or stop doing it all. So the number one thing I tell architecture students they can do for the environment is to go downshift in work time. Working half time means less consumption, less income, less consumption, and architects are among the middle class and the creative classes that have the highest footprint in terms of that we do a lot of things and we want to see a lot of things and we consume things because we identify with things. So there's also this idea that the practice is the one the mode of changing, but it's also this reluctancy to look at the profession or the person or not taking a job as being just as important as taking or as going to New Zealand or doing. But there is this sort of, I mean, that's not our society. We don't like to talk about the things we're not going to do. We like to talk about what we should do.
Swedish society or in general?
I mean, in general, but I think in Sweden as well. I mean, we like to say, well, you should do it. You should do more of it, but I don't want to step down. So it's also this idea that we can continue adding chairs to the table without anyone having ever to leave the table. So this idea of continuous growth also in terms of...
That's what we will do now, no?
Yeah.
No, because maybe some...
Yeah, those of you that know me, they know that I give it to the public right away. But I had a little one because what can I add to this enlightened discussion? Probably nothing.
Yeah.
But
we need some gender balance.
No,
now.
but I'm
you can
gender balance. There we go. But I was thinking,
I'm joking.
One small reflection on if we bring it back to urban form, and we have seen in the last 30 years different approaches to urban planning and design. Everything from urbanism that tried to create this perfect community that ended up a lot in spatial determinism, spatial possibilism, down to the green approaches, everything from Michael Reynolds' Earthships, Waiting for the Apocalypse, or to Masdar City, which is a super smart city of green packages, down to re-urbanism, star architecture, where architecture was the only thing. And now we see something else emerging, Richard Sennett's Open City, Brent Ryan's new manifesto for cities, which is sort of adaptation and reinvention of the city, democratic space opening. But at the end, Srecko, when you try to translate that into urban form, and to avoid business as usual, what do? How do we build democratic, just, inclusive cities? How do you translate that into form? That's what I think we all try to, and our students ask, how can I do it?
Well, you're expecting an answer from me.
From a philosopher, yeah.
But this is precisely the point. I don't know whether philosophers can really be useful or not, but in the time where, when everyone is sub-specialized, let's put it like that. As I said, the 5 professions of the architects which are the most aspiring ones today, big data, augmented reality, whatever. I think what we should do, but this is not only the case for architecture, it's the case for everything. Interdisciplinary cooperation is the first. Architects need philosophers, architects need social movements. It is very often that social movements find out, experiment with a different form, even before the architects, because it just appears, somehow. Be it a barricade, be it, a system of living. Tsukoti Park, for instance. It was functioning in the middle of Wall Street for more than 1 month or 2 months, how much I was there and so on. But it was interesting, not only, it was interesting in the way how, I mean, Chumi writes a lot about this, how a form can acquire a different content. And how this content became a different society inside of the existing society. So I would say my kind of modest answer to your question would be interdisciplinarity, but not interdisciplinarity in this kind of also catchphrase, if you need more disciplines and blah, blah, blah. Adisciplined, I don't know, anti-disciplinarity, I would say. In the sense that, okay, take philosophers, take social movements come to my mind as well. This changes reality. Okay,
great. Now I'm going to turn to the, and I see one question right away.
But you can also pose questions to everyone here.
Yeah, of course. All right, so Alain Frichot, Director of Critical Studies in Architecture, up here behind us on the 2nd level. And
so down there they build and up there they criticize.
Yeah. No, we get to, we can, like a quasi-panopticon, we look down on what's happening here from our windows, exactly. I thought we could return to Pompeii, because Pompeii, I thought we could return there.
Please.
Because, of course, this is where the crux of your argument comes through between the 2 options of the apocalyptic fetishism and the fetishism of denial, these 2 alternatives, and we need to find the 3rd way. And then you use Maurice Blanchot to bring you there and draw on this text, which is really interesting too, to hear about this text that was lost and then found again, which also reminds me of his text, Writing of the Disaster. It sounds like a very similar argument that he's making there. But I wanted to kind of hover around this moment where you're kind of flipping him and saying, well, here with Pompeii, the apocalypse isn't disappointing, it's interesting. And look what we discover because of what disaster has preserved for us. And then, of course, you're situating ourselves from the point of view of the present, looking back at the traces of this preserved past, which reminds me, of course, of one of the primary thought experiments that is repeated again and again in relation to the Anthropocene, which is first sort of discussed by Crutzen, but then kind of carried through and analysed through various different people for different purposes. And that is the thought experiment of, you know, in the future, having left this geological trace on the planet, anticipating either our future descendants or some alien other, they will see what we've left behind. We've imprinted this mark on the planet. But then the question is, who is it that's looking back at this disaster? Who are they exactly, and how they are even going to read the writing? And furthermore, if we carry through with your argument, then, and it's not a disappointing but a kind of interesting catastrophe, then we're also presuming that at that moment we did have to sacrifice. So sacrifice is the word that came up to me. We had to sacrifice the Pompeians in order to make the next step. So there's a sense of a risk I'm seeing here, which also ties us back into Pernilla of, well, we'll have to sacrifice the migrants in order to make the next step. And so I'm really worried about the potential of what you're setting up here in terms of the direction it could take. You know, it's interesting to look back on catastrophe from the privilege of the point of view of the present. Who is that standing there looking back, and so forth, and what have we sacrificed? I don't need to give this.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, this is the privileged position of.
First Srecko and then.
No, I mean. Okay, very short. I find it very interesting what you said. I think you're right, but my point wasn't going in that direction. You know, Pompeii is very interesting because it was obviously a fascination in arts, in philosophy, from Freud to Rossellini. But what you're saying is more connected to Primo Levi, I would say, who, interestingly enough, had a poem about Pompeii. And, you know, Primo Levi is the one who survived the disaster. And the question is, how can you write about disaster? And this is a difficult question. I wasn't going in that direction, and I wasn't dismissing the 10,000 people who died. And finally, we as architects and archaeologists and tourists can be happy because we can see all these fresks and so on. My argument was going in the direction that what you can see there, precisely helped by the disaster, is that, and I'm aware of the privileged position also of that historical time where this town was privileged as such in the Roman Empire, and you know, people inside of the town were privileged in comparison to others who came from Africa there and who were, you know, prostitutes, the females who were working there, you know, by politics if you want. But what I found interesting is that philosophically, if you imagine, you know, if today's society would be destroyed, this is the concept. There is this book, World Without Us. What would happen if humans would disappear? You know, what would be left? Even what would be left from architecture? The Eiffel Tower and so on, everything would just disappear after. If you look at Pripyat, Varosha, in Famagusta on Cyprus, what happened, you know, 3 decades after humans left, nature came back, turtles came back. It is as if humans never existed. So what is the footprint we are leaving, you know? Thanks to Vesuvius, we have a footprint, which is much better preserved than others. But my question is more, you know, this Blanchot's point about the whole. Certainly, with all the criticism which we can have from today's perspective, which is not complete, Pompeii was a kind of the whole, which disappeared, and they succeeded to create a kind of society and urban planning which was functional. What would be left out of our today's world if something like that happens? That's my question. I think more going in the direction of this world without us, nothing would happen. You know, 100 years after or 500, or it's as if we never existed. I don't know if I answered, but yeah.
But I'm just thinking that there is also this. I was reflecting on it when you were talking about this, the creation of the apocalypse as also the creation of the whole, or sort of the inevitable future in also creating a I mean, that again connects to this understanding of how we frame, I mean, the whole as being a global perspective, or is it an understanding of the global as mapping and this idea of networks, or is it situated as being human and being sort of within? I mean, there are these different understandings, and if I have then a pessimistic interpretation of that, it's also that this creation of whole is precisely in this relation to apocalypse. You get to define the whole.
That's Blanchot's point.
Yeah, but also
through the negation, you can only define which is.
Yeah, but you can also sort of misuse that, right? So that's the argument trying to be made, that we need to define as a whole our understanding of where we sort of cut the. Do we understand whole of humanity, or is it a non-human interaction, or is it? I mean, where we cut this line is also this very powerful mode. I mean, that's the narrative being created by these researchers, saying our whole is Sweden, and we should have our ties here, or that's Trump's narrative at the moment, or this common enemy as creating a whole.
Yeah, but my whole point is that the catastrophe we're facing today is so big that you have to create an international, transnational, global whole. Even if Sweden closes itself, you have an ecological disaster, nuclear war. What does it mean? What does it help? But then the interesting question, as you say, what about the whole with machines? What about the whole which are not humans?
Yeah, I mean, where do we draw that boundary of what we understand as the whole? Is it? I mean, that's been constantly shifting throughout history. How we understand ourselves and humanity and our interactions with others. Should we?
Yeah, I'm trying to see if there are any other. Oh, that was just a half move. Okay.
Yeah, but I looked like a question.
No, okay. Okay, here we go. Yeah, we're almost there.
I'll keep it short then. So what I'm thinking is that a lot of spatial experts, like architects, are so sort of dependent nowadays, especially nowadays, on this sort of capitalist system heading for apocalypse. If you say that they have to sort of, how to make architecture the tool for getting out of the apocalypse. How do you envision sort of grabbing on, sort of getting out of this system? Because what I often see is that a lot of young bureaus are very idealistic and wanting to better society, but then they also have to make money, so they make gated communities in for Russian rich people somewhere. So like this dilemma, if you will. What would be the way for architects to get out of that?
Let the machines do architecture. No, but I think this is the old Albert Speer dilemma, you know, if you want. It's not only that you do it because of money, but there is certainly a certain fascination that you now finally have the power to do it. You know, the Germania or whatever, and you have, I don't know, I mean, I don't know, but every young architect probably wants to be Rem Koolhaas or someone else, to have this kind of opportunity. I'm not comparing Koolhaas to Speer, just to say it, but to have this opportunity to have this kind of absolute power to make the biggest CCTV tower in China, or these huge, massive projects, which I think is great for any creative individual to do it. But on the other hand, you know, okay, if you're building in Qatar, in United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and so on, you have a certain responsibility. I don't know. It's as you said, it's a dilemma, so it's impossible. So it's very difficult to solve it. But I would say that really each architect, I don't know, you tell me if it's right or not, has this kind of tendency to fulfill his or her desires of building something with the power to finally do it, instead of being constantly blocked not to be able to do it because there is no funding, there is no political will.
Exactly. I just wanted to add to that I actually have kind of a different position from you, so I just wanted to make sure that comes in, because I think that withdrawal of service is not the only option, and I think it's one answer, but we can also work our asses off, and I think that's okay as well. But what I want to suggest is another alternative is also to treat with respect the kind of the architects doing the daily grind in the big offices, who at this school seem so undervalorized, and half of the students will work for those offices, where they're sitting making tiny decisions, but those decisions are meaningful. I think a sense of meaning and worth, I don't know how we do this as a discourse, as a culture together, we build up a sense of agency, but it's not going to be one pen line, it's going to be all those tiny decisions. So I would say normal jobs in big offices in 9-to-5 situations are likely to make enormous political change if we decide to...
Yeah, you need to democratize the workplace.
If we decide to talk to each other, form solidarities, talk about politics, demand, formulate our demands, formulate the problems. So I just wanted to add that as another option here, that we don't have to be either activists or star architects. We can be normal humans in a democratic system and change everything.
I couldn't find a better ending, right? I think I know our media production director said it's finished. But of course we could go on forever. And I'm just thinking one thing, why didn't we get you here before?
Why? You think something will change? Or
no, but it's like, okay, because, you know, one beautiful mind opens up other beautiful minds that are here. And it's
why would I come if you already have all these
there you
people
go.
here,
But,
you
then the conversation really goes. So I'm really happy that I assembled all four of you. And thank you all also for coming. And to be continued in a way.
If I can just say something for the end, I'm really delighted that, you know, you can hear these kind of thoughts. And there is something like critical studies of architecture. I didn't know it. Because for me, this is something new, you know. For us who are from the outside, let's put it like that, you're most of the time confronted with star architects and then all this kind of stuff. But to see that, you know, in architecture, in all this room, you have this critical approach, this is great. And I completely understand what you said. I think we need collective organizing and inside of architecture.
As Helen said, they sit here, so they watch. So,
the critical studies.
The dogma is here, right? No, I shouldn't be saying that.
Foucault around, you know. We need more Bentham.
But this also shows the seeds of transformation in architectural schools. It takes a long time, but at the end you might see some change. So, Srecko, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you all in the panel. Thank you.